Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is constitutionalism. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off talking about the advent and the form and function of absolutism in Western Europe. However, it was a very much of a large focus just on France and then ultimately kind of the decline of Spain. The reality is, though, not every nation develops an absolute monarchy. In the case in point here, the obvious example is England, Great Britain, right? Because they are a very unique case study as far as kind of the Western civilization. Because they don't embrace absolutism because the ruler, the king or queen, never has absolute power. Rather, they fall under a different topic or different term known as constitutionalism. Now, defined is government power that is limited by law. Now, again, you can see kind of why our founding fathers of the United States would embrace this model far more than, say, the monarchy ideas of France or Spain. So within this system of constitutionalism, there's a delicate balance between the power of government and the rights and liberties of individuals. Now you'll notice this is the first time we've kind of talked about this idea of individual rights, all year. But under constitutionalism that develops within England in the 17th century, we start seeing that there's this delicate balance and that individual rights and liberties of individuals matter. If you think way back to when you took, AP U.S. history or dual credit U.S. history, you remember things like, English rights or Englishmen's rights and landowning and certain things that, in one of the kind of arguments for the American Revolution was that, they weren't trying to be revolutionary in anything, but rather they were trying to restore proper English individual rights. One of the arguments for the revolution. And what we're going to see here today then is how it functions in England. So this all sounds good, right? Individual rights is fantastic. But there are some major issues trying to implement this. And one thing we're going to find is one of the big impetuses that allows this to work actually is the commercial revolution and the foundations of capitalism. Now, we can have a long debate about capitalism, merits, and failures and anything else you want to talk about. But right now, capitalism is a very, positive role in pushing forward the idea of constitutionalism. So capitalism plays a major role because it creates social mobility. So whereas you have the kind of three estate system in France, that does not necessarily exist in England. And as a result of this kind of social mobility where people can move up. Now remember, if you remember back to U.S. history, you remember that it didn't really exist too much in early 1600s, but by the time we get to late 1600s and the 1700s, you start seeing a large increase in the size of the middle class. You start seeing improved agricultural techniques that improves farming and can thus, feed a larger population. And so this is the positive side of things. This is what's kind of pushing this idea. However, on the other side of things, the Stuart kings, the Stuart lineage, they believed authority came from God, and they didn't want any parliamentary restraints. And then there was the other problem of the gentry and the church. Of course, the gentry are your wealthy landowners who came to dominate politics in the House of Commons, which is the lower house of Parliament. Oh, and then there's a religious problem. Remember all that religious turmoil England experienced? Yeah, that's still a problem. Yeah, Calvinists become the largest percentage of the population in the early 17th century. And again, that should make sense to you. If you remember U.S. history, remember the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the Separatists. And again, they're Calvinist. And they remember they're trying to seek to purify the Anglican Church, the Church of England, from any vestige of Catholicism. And as a result of this, the Anglican Church itself begins to lose much ground in society. That's the negative part for England. The positive side, though, is that the Puritans, the Calvinists, they believed in something and developed something called the Protestant work ethic. The idea is that you're supposed to work hard to show yourself approved to God. And it's okay to make money. Whereas often religions kind of taught poverty mentality, Calvinists believe that you should work hard and God will reward you with wealth. And this Protestant work ethic allowed people to increase social mobility, spread and enlarge the middle class. However, at the same time, pushing against those Stuart kings, Calvinists were in particular opposed to any influence of the Catholic Church, including a couple of royals like James I and Charles I, who we'll talk about later, because they seemed very sympathetic to Catholicism. So these are the competing forces in England, right? You have the nobility, the Stuart king. We'll talk about them in a second here, and their role. But you have the House of Commons led by those nobles, the gentry. You have the middle class that's expanding and burgeoning under capitalism. You have these farmers who are growing in wealth because of new farming techniques and technology. You have the decline of the Anglican Church, but at the same time you see a rise in Calvinism that is creating some problems, but also expanding that middle class because of the Protestant work ethic. So let's talk about some problems facing these English monarchs. Remember, these English monarchs, the Stuart kings, they want absolute authority. Every king does. They want that absolute power. So let's talk about the Stuart dynasty here. The Stuarts ruled England for most of the 17th century. You see the lineage on your screen right here. And we're going to talk about a lot of these, so you may want to screenshot this. The Stuarts ruled England for most of the 17th century. And although they exhibit absolutist tendencies, they were quite restrained by the growth of Parliament. Now, this is done for a couple reasons. So, on the one hand, they are restrained by Parliament because of the Parliament function in England, their government setup. They will be automatically restrained. Now, certain royalty are able to kind of skirt around Parliament due to being politically astute. Now, Elizabeth I was a prime example. She was able to get things done almost as an absolutist monarch. Again, not quite, but almost, because she was able to use her political astuteness. She had a strong political acumen. On the other hand, the rulers for most of the 17th century, namely James I and Charles I, they lacked this. And so leading up to the English Civil War, there were some major issues, and namely revolving around the power of the king. And the question became could the King of England govern without the consent of Parliament? Or could they go against the wishes of Parliament? That's question number one. So can the king rule without consent, or can they go against the wishes of Parliament? Number two, would the form of the Anglican Church follow the established hierarchy or acquire a more Presbyterian form? You see, traditionally, the Anglican Church was what was called the Episcopalian style, the Episcopal style, which meant king. So Episcopalian form is more of a high top-down hierarchy. That is the king on top, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the bishops of the church that determine church doctrine. The more Presbyterian form is where the presbyters determine things. Presbyterian form allows more freedom of conscience and dissent among church members. Now, to give you an idea here of kind of future turmoil, England proper embraced the Episcopalian style, the Episcopal style. Scotland, who will long be a trouble spot for England, we have a lot of wars with them, they embrace the more Presbyterian style, which allows more dissent, which makes surprise why they run amok then when it comes to, out of favor with England. So let's examine a couple of these monarchs. I dub them Monarch the First because we're talking about James and Charles the First. You see on your screen there. So we have King James the First. Now, he's dubbed King James for a couple of reasons. One, yeah, he's obviously King James. He's also the one, however, who also commissioned the King James Version of the Bible in 1611. And it's still a highly influential version of the Bible to the present day. Now, there are some issues with it as far as the translation that we could talk about ad nauseum, because it's being translated not from the original, but from another English translation. But it is kind of one of the number one used Bibles in the English world when it comes to Christians, even in 2020. So Elizabeth I left no heir to the throne when she died in 1603. Now James VI of Scotland was next in line to assume the throne. Thus, England got a Scottish king. And so he renamed himself, of course, James I, the first of his name. James believed in the divine right of kings. He claimed that no bishop, no king, in response to Calvinists who wanted to eliminate the system of bishops in the Church of England. In other words, he believes in that strict hierarchical episcopal style of church. You have a king, you have a bishop, you have a hierarchy. He was a firm believer in absolutism. He was being pressured by Puritans to purify the Anglican Church, but he didn't do so because he thought it would threaten his control. Instead, he dissolves Parliament. So, because he believes he's an authoritarian, absolutist king, that kings have the divine right, placed by God, he will actually twice dissolve Parliament. So, first issue is over taxation and over free speech. And so you see on the list right there. So he has Elizabeth I leaves behind a large debt. He will have a series of wars that will be very costly. And he will unwisely flaunt that wealth, not to mention his male lovers. And it will damage the prestige of the monarchy. And then we have the second one, which is Charles I. There we go. There's good old Charles. He takes over in 1625 for his father, James I. Now, like James, he believed in divine right, absolute authority for himself as king. He could rule without Parliament. But he also sought control over the Church of England, far more than his father did. Now, ultimately, it'll be tax issues that will kind of pit him against Parliament. You see, Charles needs money to fight war, but the power of the purse, as the modern day vernacular says, belong to Parliament. So, because he knows he needs Parliament, he tries to find ways around Parliament when he needs money to fight wars. For example, he would quarter soldiers in English homes during wartime. Very unpopular. And again, please note the dates here. This is not leading up to the American Revolution yet. There's still 100 years. But quartering soldiers in English homes. Some English nobles were arrested for refusing to lend money to the government. So rather than ask Parliament for money, he would go directly to nobles, and if they refused to give him money, he arrested them. And by 1628, both the House of Lords and House of Commons in Parliament firmly opposed the king. So by 1628, Parliament attempted to encourage the king to kind of allow basic legal rights. So Parliament says, okay, king, we know you need money because you want money to fight wars, you want money to, fill your coffers. So how about this? We will give you extra tax money. We will grant tax increases if you will grant basic legal rights in exchange. So they're going to make a deal with the king here. It's known as the Petition of Right. And so they outline this Petition of Right in 1628. And this is because they're at their last straw. They're ticked off. Both House of Lords, House of Commons are ticked off at the king. And so they say, okay, you want tax increases, we'll give them to you. If and only if you agree to our demands, including basic legal rights for citizens. So these provisions included only Parliament has the right to tax. So they're reaffirming their right to tax. Number 2, no one should be imprisoned or detained without due process of law, habeas corpus. Number 3, habeas corpus, right to speedy trial. So we have no one should be imprisoned or detained without due process. Notice some ideas in the U.S. Constitution. Habeas corpus, right to a trial. No forced quartering of soldiers in private homes. Boy, that only worked with the U.S. colonies. Oh yeah, and martial law can't be declared during peacetime. Now, these are fairly basic, simple things that you would think would be amenable to Charles, but poor Charlie did not like this. So in 1629, he dissolves Parliament, like his father had. But yet, he dissolves Parliament, but Parliament continues to refuse to increase taxation without his consent. And Parliament demanded any movement of the government toward Catholicism be treason. Now, if you remember your U.S. history, you remember that he will actually marry a Catholic wife, and in 1628, they will have a Catholic child who baptized Catholic, which means the heir to the throne now is, in fact, Catholic. And so between 1629 and 1640, this becomes known as the Thorough, because Charles is going to rule without Parliament for a good, 11 years. Which is kind of funny. This is also during the time of the Great Migration of the Puritans to New England. Remember, the Great Migration was 1630, 1640. So while they're fleeing England, Charlie's ruling by essentially divine right, almost absolutist ideas, because he has dissolved Parliament. He begins to raise money using medieval forms of taxation. In other words, forcing nobles to pay an obligated amount. There was religious persecution of Puritans during this time frame. Because remember, he's leaning Catholic. And you notice this is the Great Migration. They are fleeing toward the Americas. And this will ultimately become the biggest reason for the English Civil War that is coming in just a short time. Now, in 1640, there's a Scottish military revolt in 1639 and 1640. And it happens because good old King Charles attempted to impose the English prayer book on the Scottish Presbyterian Church. Now remember, we had this issue earlier. We talked about the Scottish are very Presbyterian. There's a lot more dissent. They don't like the top-down hierarchy. Whereas Charles is, of course, imposing more Catholic ideas and embracing that Episcopal style. And so Charles knows he needs extra money, that the medieval form of taxation is not working. And so in 1640, he will reconvene Parliament. But he will reconvene Parliament as a way to get them to give him taxes to fight this war against Scotland. Parliament will be reconvened in 1640, known as the Short Parliament, but it will refuse to grant Charles any new taxes if he won't accept the rights outlined in that Petition of Rights from 1628. So 12 years later, they're still holding on to this thing. 12 years later, they're still looking for this Petition of Rights. And when Charles refuses to grant these basic rights, he will dissolve Parliament again after only 1 month. Talk about dysfunctional government. Now, desperate for money after a second Scottish invasion of northern England in later 1640, Charles will finally agree to certain demands of Parliament. So first and foremost, Parliament says that they will never again be dissolved without their own consent. So we're going to stop this whole dumb idea. Parliament will have to agree to, at a minimum, meet every 3 years. Now, remember, this is not like modern day where you are daily at the government building. So they had a minimum meet at least once every 3 years. And the leaders of the persecution of Puritans had to be tried and executed. This included one of the archbishops. That Star Chamber we talked about in period 1, that will be abolished. But common law courts would be supreme and reign over the king's courts. The result of this ultimately is Puritans came to represent the majority in Parliament. Thus, we're setting up a religious turmoil in Parliament itself now. Remember, Charles is leaning Catholic. His supporters in Parliament lean Catholic. But the majority now in Parliament is now Puritan, Calvinist. And this all leads to the English Civil War. Now, the immediate cause, again, there's some long causes here, right? We've talked about this already. It's been going on since essentially 1603 when James I takes over. There's some long causes. But the immediate cause was Charles attempted to arrest several Puritans in Parliament. So remember, this majority of Parliament was Puritan. He doesn't like Parliament. He has a great animosity toward him. And he attempts to arrest several Puritans. But coming to their defense, a crowd of 4,000 Englishmen came to Parliament's defense. They want this idea of constitutional government. They believe in it. Now, Charles did this ostensibly because of an Irish rebellion breaking out, and once again, Parliament not willing to give the king an army. And so he tries to arrest these Puritans, which leads to 4,000 people show up to back Parliament. And so in March of 1642, Charles declares war against his opponents in Parliament. His army comes from the nobility, the rural country gentry, and mercenaries. And the Civil War broke up into two different groups. On the one hand, you have what's called the Cavaliers. Cavaliers support the king. They're usually clergy or supporters of the Anglican Church, the old gentry, nobility, eventually Irish Catholics, because even though they were Irish who were not usually treated very well by, often by England, they were at first Catholics, and they were they were more fearful of Puritanism than they were Anglicanism. So on the one hand, you have the Cavaliers, who are your clergy, supporters of the Anglican Church, the old nobility, and these Irish Catholics. On the other side of things was the Calvinists, known as Roundheads. These Roundheads oppose the king. And again, these are largely Puritans, and also Scotland. Now, Scottish themselves were not necessarily in favor of the Puritans. However, the Puritans in England guaranteed that if they win, that they will not impose the episcopal style of church in Scotland, allow them to continue being Presbyterian. And as a result of, and also businessmen. And one more. The Navy and the Merchant Marines. So, the wealth is on the side of the king. But you have the Merchant Marines, you have the Navy, and you have that Protestant work ethic that's enabled a much wealthier middle class to be part of the Roundheads. So you have the Roundheads against the Cavaliers. Sounds like a bad NBA Finals game. Now, one of the prominent military leaders here is a man by the name of Oliver Cromwell. I'm sure most of you actually heard his name in history. He's a fiercely Puritan, independent, and military leader of the Roundheads. And he will lead what is known as the New Model Army to victory in 1649. And ultimately, Charles will have to surrender himself to the Scots. Parliament orders the army to disband, but Cromwell refuses. So Cromwell leads the Roundheads to victory, right? And immediately the Parliament says, okay, so thanks very much. You served us very well. Let's get rid of the army now and get back to choosing a new king. And Oliver Cromwell's like, no, I'm good. We're good here. I'm stick around for a while. And ultimately, in 1649, they will behead Charles I, which effectively ends the Civil War. He will be the first king in European history to be beheaded by his own subjects or executed by his own subjects. He won't be the last, of course, the French. However, the result of this war, before we get to the political part, will create a number of new religious sects that kind of devolve from mainstream Puritanism. You have a new group known as the Levelers. Now, the Levelers were radical religious revolutionaries who would seek both social and political reforms. In other words, they want a more egalitarian society. They, in some ways, are kind of an early form of communism in a way. They wanted more egalitarian society. So they're levelers. Then you have the diggers, who deny Parliament's authority and reject private ownership. Again, you can see why these are considered more radical. This is, again, an idea of communism. That was not, then, remember, communism does not exist yet, as far as the philosophy of it. Not Marxist. Marx is not around yet. But the levelers and diggers, they really do kind of embrace those general ideas of that idea of egalitarian, no government, no parliament to rule, but rather everyone's equal. And then you have the Quakers. Now, I'm not going to spend a long time on these either, because remember this from last year from U.S. history. But remember, they believe in the inner light, the divine spark that exists in each person. They reject church authority. They're pacifist. And they allow women to play a role and teach. Remember, the idea was that everyone would show up together for a service. They would kind of just meditate and wait for God's unction, the Holy Spirit, to give someone the word, who then get up and give the word. And so they quaked when they fell in the power of the Holy Spirit, which is why they got the name Quakers. But the idea was they had no authority, no preacher, no pastor, no reverend, no minister. And they reject all forms of necessary authority. And they're not against leadership, but they're against that hierarchical form that can impose problems. And again, you can see all three of these are issues with authority. They want a more egalitarian society. Again, this is all a result of war. They're tired of living in warfare. They want a more egalitarian society, which is one of the reasons why Quakers are pacifists. Now, what happens next is known as the interregnum. And it's a period of rule without a king. And so between 1649, the end of the English Civil War, and 1660, we will have this period that we say is under Oliver Cromwell, but he's not a king. Rather, we establish first what's called a commonwealth. So between 1649 and 1653, we will establish in England a commonwealth. It's a republic that abolishes the monarchy in the House of Lords. Wow. So wait. While the colonies are starting to prosper here, England's got these ideas of a commonwealth, a republic, where they abolish the monarchy and they abolish the House of Lords, only leaving the House of Commons, hence Commonwealth. Now, on the one hand, this sounds really good. However, in reality, it only lasts 4 years, from 1649 to 1653. But in reality, England became a military state under Oliver Cromwell. Remember, he was the one who led them to victory in the English Civil War. And he still leads an army of 44,000 men, the best in Europe. Now, there were some challenges to this rule. The Scottish Presbyterians, who had opposed Puritan rule, because remember, he's a Puritan, Cromwell is, they proclaimed Charles II as the new king, and Cromwell will once again defeat a Scottish invasion. In 1649, he will also put down an Irish uprising. Now, as far as what else besides just war, I mean, he puts down the Scottish in 1649. He puts down the Irish in 1649. He will actually conquer Scotland in 1651. In 1652, he will pass the Act of Settlement that will give 2/3 of Catholic property owners, 2/3 of the land from Catholic property owners will be given to Protestant English colonists. Now, so from 1649 to 1653, Cromwell is subduing dissidents. He's taking land under the auspices he's not a king, but under the auspices that he is a commonwealth, the leader of a republic. In 1653, though, Cromwell just gives up all preconceptions. In 1653, he declares himself the Lord Protector of England. This becomes known as the Protectorate. I got that on my screen. The Protectorate. So the Protectorate in 1653, from 1653 to 1659, Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England, divides England into 12 districts, each under the control of a military general. Okay? So 12 districts, each under a military general. Denies religious freedom to both Catholics and Anglicans, so Puritan only. He does allow Jews to return to England who have not allowed. So in 1655, he actually allows Jews to return to England for the first time since the year 1290. It's been almost 400 years, but Jews are allowed to return to England. But hold on, let's go back to those first two for a minute. 12 districts, each led by a military general, denying religious freedom. Oh yeah, this is a dictatorship. And so England, who started off as a monarchy, vying for absolutist control, has now devolved, thanks to an English civil war, into a dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. The press was heavily censored, sports were prohibited, theaters were closed. In doing this, he was trying to impose strict moral codes based on Puritan beliefs. This is what happens when you have a religious group in power. This is one of the reasons why in the colonies they advocated for separation of church and state during the First Great Awakening. They don't want one religion or denomination to be favored. This is the basis of our Constitution, religious freedom. And so because England is doing this under the dictatorship of Cromwell, you are seeing the strict moral code enforced. The press is censored, sports prohibited, theaters closed. This will begin to seriously alienate many English people from the military rule. Now, in 1658, Cromwell dies, and his son Richard was very ineffective. And thus, in 1660, again, thanks to an ineffective son, the Stuarts under Charles II will regain the throne and restore the royal authority in 1660. Now, this is known as the Restoration period, from 1660 to 1685. They're going to restore the throne. So a Cavalier Parliament, remember the Cavaliers who supported the king? The Cavalier Parliament, who's upset with the rule under Cromwell, is going to restore the throne to the Stuart monarchs. Now, while in exile, Charles II will agree to abide by Parliament's decisions in the post-war settlement. Parliament emerges stronger than ever in relation to the king. Thus, the power of the king is not absolute. Now, as a result, he's just kind of happy to be there. He will actually become known as the quote-unquote merry monarch, known for his very affable personality. And it is during this period that we start seeing the development of two notable political parties in Parliament. The first group is known as the Tories. These are nobles, gentry, and Anglicans who support the monarchy over Parliament. So the Tories are those who support the king having more authority than Parliament. On the other political party that developed is known as the Whigs. These are middle class and Puritans who favor Parliament, have greater parliamentary control, and religious toleration, which makes them more liberal in the classical sense, power to the people. Hold on. It's like I've heard those terms before. Whigs and Tories. Oh, yeah. The same groups that we talked about in U.S. history. So you have the Tories who support the monarchical rule, and you have the Whigs who support a more parliamentarian view, or parliamentarian rule. Now, Charles II seemed to support Catholics, and he will draw heavy criticism from Whigs in Parliament, because Charles will grant freedom of worship to Catholics. He will make a deal with Louis XIV in 1670, whereby France will give England money every year in exchange for Charles relaxing restrictions on Catholics. Charles will also dissolve Parliament when it passed a law denying royal succession to Catholics. So Parliament passes a law that says, okay, royal succession is fine as long as the successor is not a Catholic. And as a result, Charles dissolves Parliament and then on his deathbed declares himself a Catholic. Now, Parliament in 1679, upon his death, is going to pass the Habeas Corpus Act. This is in part to limit Charles's power. So it enables judges to demand that prisoners be in court during their trials, requires just cause for imprisonment, speedy trials, also forbids double jeopardy. And again, this is all being done to curb the power of the king, who might use the court system for political purposes. Well, so in 1679 that's passed. In 1685, Charles declares himself Catholic and dies. And in 1685, his brother James takes the throne. And age 55, he will take the throne from his brother Charles II, and he will seek to return England to Catholicism by appointing many Catholics to high positions in government and in colleges. And this is going to lead to another struggle for power and sovereignty in England. Let's take a break here, come back to that in part B of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.